What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Probably not what you're thinking. Welcome to Curious Christianity. I'm Adam, and today we're talking about the subject of the Imago Dei, the image of God. And it's amazing how many different areas of theology and ethics are put into this little conversation on the image of God. And if there's so much intellectual, theological weight behind it, then shouldn't we be able to agree on what it means? Instead, I have found this to be one of the most difficult, challenging questions for many, many years. And for many years, I often struggled reading systematic theology books about how they would describe it and what they would say that it was. But ultimately, I feel like I've come to a resolution about it. So let's dive in a little bit. It seems to me that a lot of people have put in a lot of these ideas about the image of God being about us having a soul or a mind or perhaps free will. Maybe it's the idea that we're tripartite. We have a body, soul, and spirit, or that we have some sort of relational capacities like the Trinity. And a lot of people have put forward a ton of these ideas, and all of them have seemed to struggle, in my opinion, over time. Like at some point, I'm running into this situation where I'm just like, okay, but how does it fit into this situation? Or how does it work with this? Or even, of course, the question is, how do I know that is what the Bible meant when it said the image of God? Like it was very difficult for me to arrive at those conclusions. They partially just seemed arbitrary. People were trying to fit in solutions. And they were trying to also say, it's like, well, the image of God is unique to humankind. So what is it about humans that are unique? And then almost kind of fitting that into the gap. But it was difficult for me to see it in the Bible itself. Like, how could I find the good scriptural hermeneutic that supported the view that this has something to do with the Trinity, that it has something to do with the free will, or the fact that humans have reasoning? None of these things were seeming to make very much sense. And of course, the original place where we see the image of God mentioned is Genesis chapter 1, which is where we have been focusing a lot of my time, energy, and stuff studying. So why don't we take a little bit deeper dive into the context of Genesis 1? And I think that it reveals a much clearer picture than anyone else had ever explained to me personally. I have not seen this directly in any systematic books, and it's got to be out there somewhere, but I'm a little surprised that this wasn't a bigger part of many of the textbooks that I read when I was younger. So let's start with Genesis, verse 1 and 2, where it's talking about God created the heavens and the earth was, chaotic and disordered, right? The tohu abohu. And there's another video coming soon. I'll post that video in the description as soon as it's done. But it's this idea that the world was kind of out of sorts. And so it's like, okay, so the world's out of sorts. And then here come the 6 days of creation where God is ordering the world. He's organizing, he's separating the light from the darkness. He's creating animals. He's creating things here and there. He's doing all sorts of things to arrange this world. And I think it's important that we recognize, like I've said before, the point of Genesis 1 seems to be about the creation for mankind. And one of the really key aspects here is that it doesn't mention the creation of the angels. I think that's very significant and very important because we all agree and know that the angels are created at some point, but they're not mentioned here. And I think that it's wrong for us to assume that Genesis 1 is talking about all of creation. Everything that was created is what it has in view. Nowhere is that indicated into the text. People assume that it's the case. And perhaps it's the case when it says God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But as far as days 1 through 7, I don't think that's what he has in view. And that's what's really, really important, right? So 1 through, all the days of creation are coming back and addressing a little bit of this verse 2, right? The tohu abohu, the world was, empty and void. But if you look up that word in the Hebrew and you look up like, oh, well, what does that mean? More often it means this idea of chaos and disorder. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there's something else that's really interesting that happens, right? It seems like God is ordering and he's creating the world in the fashion that he wants. And then, of course, on day 7, he rests, right? He rests on day 7. He's no longer creating or organizing and fixing things up. And of course, some people believe that he created the world perfect and fine and all of that. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in the text. And I don't think it's the case, in the text. And I've given one of my other videos this idea that the world wasn't perfect. And part of the reason I think that the world wasn't perfect was because God had work for man to do. So, and this goes back to man's image. The reason that God rests is because the last thing that he does is he sets mankind down on the earth and gives him the authority and the dominion mandate. Let's read this little portion from Genesis real quick, right? Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over the livestock, over all the wild animals, over all the wild creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And the reason this is so significant is because he says, I've created man in my image. This is what they're going to do. Be fruitful and multiply, rule over all of my creation, right? So since he's telling everyone, he's telling mankind, you are to rule over my creation. Later on, we see in Psalm 8, he says, "Well, for I have created man a little lower than the angels," which is one of the reasons I don't think you see angels being created. Do you think that God established man as ruler over the angels in Genesis chapter 1? I would suggest the answer is no, which is part of the reason you don't see a creation narrative for the angels, because God is establishing the creation narrative for man of what he is to rule over, of what man's dominion is supposed to be. So, as Michael Heiser has pointed out, probably something that would be less misleading for English speakers, because prepositions are a little tricky in the whole Hebrew scenario, is that it's a little closer to saying God created man as his image. In other words, mankind is to represent God on the earth. He's to represent God over everything. He's to be the one that's to spread the knowledge of God, the wisdom of God, the rule of God over the whole earth. So in this notion, right, it's man's job to make sure that God is represented on the earth. That's what it means to be an image bearer. Man is the image. He's the representative of God over the whole earth. And this is something that in the Hebrew context, in the whole ancient Mesopotamia and all of those ancient contexts, would be much better understood. Man is kind of the vice regent. They're the ones that are to take over and rule over in the name of God. And that's what it means to be really made in the image of God. And I think that's so much more evident from the context of Genesis chapter 1, from what we see God talking about here, that what it means to be made in God's image doesn't have as much to do with if we have a soul or a mind or intellect or free will, but rather it has to do with that God has elected us. He has specifically declared us as his image. And it's by that authority that we are the rightful rulers. We are the rightful ones to rule over and do things in God's name. And so we should subdue the earth and all of these other things that we're called to do. And, by being fruitful and multiply, that's how you spread. You conquer the territory by spreading. In some fields of war, that's one of the ways you take over is by childbirth. You simply rule over by population. So I think this is really what God has envisioned, and it shouldn't be nearly as perhaps mysterious as we've made it out to be. Although I do think that it's profound. It's very profound that God declares us as his image, that he declares us to be the ones to rule over and to take dominion over the earth. So, as we move forward, I think it's important for us to remember who God has declared us as human beings, that we can have dignity as human beings to represent God before all of creation. So, if you learned something new today, please subscribe, share, and hammer that like button. See you in the next video.